This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 367. Don't game the credit system. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about not gaming the credit system with the one and only Tim Lehnen. Tim is the Chief Technology Officer of the Drupal Association. He has been a guest host on the podcast these last 4 weeks. And when not working with the DA engineering team to support Drupal initiatives, he tries to get in some creative time playing music and writing fiction. Tim, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again. Good to be here.
Absolutely. I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-host is Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Nick, how are you?
Good morning. I'm doing great. Looking forward to this topic. It's going to be a good one.
It is. I'm very excited to talk about that. Before we get to that and our module of the week, though, we have a special guest to tell us a little bit about the New England Drupal Camp. Stephen Cross, take it away.
Hey, the New England Drupal Camp is happening on November 18th and 19th in Providence, Rhode Island. NetCamp is a 2-day event. Friday is our training day with half and full day trainings. Saturday is our session day with 20 sessions and a keynote. Our keynote speaker is Colleen Clarkston. He is a remote work expert, and we'll be talking about career contributions and how community can change your life. And it did it for him. Our training and sessions cover a variety of topics, including accessibility, Drupal 101, front-end, decoupled, career development, and much, much more. We also have some extras here. So if you come to NetCamp, we have a social event on Friday evening hosted at Oomph, our event sponsor. We also provide breakfast, lunch, and an after party on Saturday. And yes, we have some t-shirts, so come get your t-shirt. We also have a Contrib Day on Friday, so don't miss that as well. You can visit netcamp.org to register and learn more. Register for training, register for sessions. Hopefully we see you there.
Yeah, NetCamp's going to be great this year. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Stephen, for telling us about that. And let's move on to our module of the week, which is one I can't believe we haven't talked about. I think anybody that's done Solar Search with Drupal has probably used this module. We're talking about the Facets module, right? So the Facets module is one that you basically can use it to do some filtering, right? Some faceted searching of your results. Typically, I've used it, and I'm interested to see if you guys have used it differently, but typically I've used it to create kind of like checkbox filters on the side of a search results to be able to filter those down to specific items. Any other use cases that you guys have for those?
It's used across Drupal.org. So the project search features on Drupal.org are using facets. The general documentation search features use facets. Like if you want a case study, it is kind of fundamental to how people navigate Drupal.org, search for projects, and all that sort of thing. So really key module.
It's a really powerful module with everything search. It doesn't have to be Solar. If you use Elasticsearch or any search API endpoint, except for maybe Algolia, it will kind of work out of the box. The other thing that I've done with it fairly often is if you have a taxonomy that has an hierarchy and you want to easily show that hierarchy in the dropdown or checkboxes, but for really long hierarchies in a dropdown, that's really the only easy way that I've seen to do it. And it's changed quite. I actually just started using it for the first time in Drupal 9 recently. Because I had, a couple of more complex facets that I needed to implement. It's changed a little bit since Drupal 7, but it was still, pretty easy to get up and running and get it on a page.
Yeah, I guess I've also used it in a commerce environment as well, like to do like shop filters and stuff like that. But I was not aware that it works with other things other than solar. I've never used Elasticsearch, I don't think. So it's good to hear that it's versatile in that way.
Yep. It's pretty straightforward.
All right, cool. Well, go out and facet your searches, people. It's there, just waiting for you to use it. Let's jump into our primary topic. So we're talking about gaming the credit system, or not gaming the credit system, as we prefer. We actually had a recent episode, episodes 361, where we talked to Matthew Tift about the Drupal credit system, and got a pretty good overview of the ins and outs of that system. For our conversation today, though, Tim, can you give us a brief overview of what the credit system is?
Sure. And I appreciate the shout out to Matthew Tift and Dries and myself and the former Drupal CTO, Josh, all came together very, very early on to help develop the credit system for Drupal based on some initial ideas from Dries. But the sort of fundamental idea behind the credit system is that you can attribute the work you've done as represented by a comment on an issue in a various different ways. You can say, hey, I did this work purely as an individual. I did this work on behalf of an organization, or I did this work on behalf of a client. And you can kind of mix and match any combination and permutation of those attributions. And then a maintainer takes all of those comments or all of those attributions once an issue is being closed and says these ones deserve credit. And then an algorithm on the Drupal.org side weights those credits and factors them into various things on the site. It creates a resume of contributions on your profile, and it's also used as a ranking factor for the marketplace of organizations on Drupal.org to sort of promote the organizations that give folks the most time for contribution.
So who governs the credit system? Who's in charge of making decisions?
That's a really good question. So officially, the credit system is managed by the Drupal Association. So governance falls under the Drupal Association most broadly. There's actually a specific committee of the board that's sort of responsible for the overarching strategy of the credit system. And that committee is made up of the two community elected seats, so that there's direct kind of community representation related to the credit system. And optionally a third-party non-Drupal appointed member to help govern it as well. So in the past, we've had Jono Bacon as a sort of third-party independent consultant on that committee. Yes,
I love Jono Bacon.
Yes, for the first year and a half or so of the credit system, he was sort of the third-party committee member, and fortunately, we got it relatively right, so we didn't have to like have too much going on to get it sorted out. But and then when it comes to the day-to-day, the Drupal Association staff, particularly on the engineering team, and myself in particular, do a lot of day-to-day sort of management, cleanup, tweaking, just sort of maintenance of that system on an ongoing basis.
And since you mentioned that it's governed by some of the community board members, we do have an election going on right now.
That's correct. Yes. So every year there's an election for one of the two seats on the Drupal Association board that are elected by the community, and each of those seats gets a 2-year term. So they're just staggered. And that election is open to any Drupal Association individual member. So if you are an individual member, you should have already received in your email a ballot from Helios Voting, which is the platform that we use for that voting process. Voting, I think, is open till October 15th or 19th. But so we encourage you to go to Drupal.org/association/elections. You can meet all of the candidates. There's profiles of every candidate who's run currently up. And then you can fill out your ballot. And we use an approval voting system, so you can approve of multiple candidates, and whichever candidate you decide, whichever candidate gets the most approval across the most ballots will ultimately be our winner.
Awesome. And not to derail too much, but if you're interested in learning more about John O'Bacon, you can check out episode 265, and he will actually be joining us in November to talk about burnout. So,
awesome. Very cool.
Very timely. Okay. So before we dive too deep into, not gaming the credit system, let's talk a little bit about what gaming the system kind of means.
Yeah. This is a tricky question, right? Because gamification in general is a controversial topic. And incentive structures are a controversial topic. I know that when Matthew was on the podcast, he talked a lot about sort of the philosophical underpinnings and some of the research around leaderboards, around kind of measuring people against each other, about what happens if you set a target and how that affects behavior. So stepping back for a second, right? What's the whole point of having a contribution credit system, right? What are the actual goals? And there's a few goals. I would say there's two primary ones, though. One is just recognizing what people do, right? Actually recording and recognizing the contributions they're making to the project without any kind of without any baggage attached to it. Just being able to say, hey, if I look at a person's profile, I want to see that history, that sort of resume of all the different places they've been involved and contributed, both code and non-code, right? The system can be used for anything that can be done in a Drupal.org issue. But the second reason is to try and deliberately shape behaviors in the community. We want more contribution to Drupal, and we want, in particular, employers of Drupal developers to be motivated to grant contribution time to their contributors, right? Now, how do you motivate an economic entity, a business? You usually give them some sort of incentive or reward that affects their business. And in this case, right, the motivation is it can improve your marketplace rating. So gaming the system comes into play because we've now created a financial incentive to have more contribution credit and to have higher weighted contribution credit. So in theory, what this could mean is any number of things. It could be, when you think about gaming the system, depending on your point of view, you could consider even legitimate, valuable contribute. You could consider it based on motivation. Is the person only doing this to try and get credits? Or you can consider it based on sort of a value metric, although I think that's problematic, and we'll talk about that more. Or you consider it like, is it a spam sort of situation where someone is sort of just kind of flooding material in the hopes that maintainers will grant them credit? So, it's a little bit hard to decide what gaming, strictly speaking, is, but, in general, it is trying to, let's say, exploit the algorithm for marketplace ranking in order to sort of maximize ranking improvements with minimal effort, I would say, is a decent definition.
Yeah. If we wanted to maybe simplify that, right? It's like using the gaming system to improve your position dishonestly or
inauthentically, maybe.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and I think another side of it too is some also in a way that's counterproductive to the community, right? Because it's we don't want to just say that gaming the system is just like, oh, you found this exploit where you hit this button and it gives you credit, right? Yeah. Because ultimately, for example, if somebody just creates their own project and then opens 1,000 issues and then closes those issues and gives them some credit, I mean, technically that's gaming the system. That harms other people by boosting them over others in the marketplace, possibly. But the Drupal community itself isn't really harmed from that, other than Drupal.org now having thousands of open and closed issues with particular projects,
basically. Yeah.
But there are other types of gaming the system where, if somebody, and I think some of these examples might have been in a blog post by Mike Herschel, where people wrote a way to re-roll patches that didn't actually need to be re-rolled or wasn't re-rolling them accurately just as a way to make sure that they got credit. And now that type of gaming is harmful for the community because it creates more work for those maintainers. They don't know that it's not a real reroll, or like they're taking time to look at it and comment on it. So there's different ways. There's different
lines we could draw about
exactly
what counts as gaming, and it can be blurry. Sometimes it can be tricky. Something doesn't have to be hard to be a legitimate contribution, right? You know, novice issues are great examples of like people making simple coding standards, documentation fixes, all sorts of things. And those can be legitimate, even if someone is doing a bunch of them across projects. Those can be genuinely useful. So, and they can be an entry point to contributing more. So we want to be really careful when we talk about gaming, that gaming, what we're concerned about is not people being motivated financially. That's okay. That's designed into the system. We knew that would happen when it was part of the marketplace. So that's not necessarily a negative. And we're not concerned necessarily about relatively easy contributions or frequent contributions. Those are both good things too. What we're concerned about is that inauthenticity, that sort of dishonesty, or like you said, those sort of broken contributions, things that look like contribution, but like they don't apply, patches don't apply, all these sorts of things. And they're just doing a bunch of those and leaving someone else to clean it up, right? Where we know that it's actually creating more burden than it is creating value.
And also to be clear, each of these situations, some of them can be done with intent, you know, like maliciously, and some of them could just be, you know, they were trying to write the next Rector bot and just misconfigured it, or they just didn't know better. So sometimes it's, you know, an education issue. Sometimes it's let's work with the community and figure it out. And sometimes it is, you know, a bad actor. So you can't just look at the type and be like, oh, that's somebody intentionally trying to game the system.
You can't just bucket them all together just because they look the same. And it's really important. And I've talked about this with a lot of project maintainers because there's an important aspect of this that the maintainers control. But project maintainers in general, as they talk about this, most of the ones I've talked to have said, look, we want to treat this as an opportunity to onboard new contributors to the project or to level up people who are trying to contribute more, right? And that can be part of our metric for understanding whether someone is contributing authentically. Are they receptive to hearing feedback that says, hey, this wasn't helpful, could you do X instead? Or when they receive those sorts of messages, are they just ignoring it and continuing what they did before on another project, right? That's the kind of signal that says, okay, this person isn't really authentically engaging with what we want to see.
So what are the kind of motivations can there be to game the system other than marketplace? Because I think there is a lot of pressure from people's companies to try to get more contributions, but there's certainly other factors that can motivate an individual or a company to.
Yeah, there's several. So, you know, the obvious one feels like the marketplace, and that's the one that's most sort of centrally controlled by the Drupal Association, right? So that's the one where we can do algorithm tweaks, we can adjust sort of our rules, we can train our maintainers, and we can have some control over that. But there are other motivations that we can't necessarily influence us directly. One of the big ones that has started coming up, and honestly, I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled the first time I saw it, was RFPs, particularly government RFPs, that now include, hey, we want to see X number of contributions on anyone who responds to our RFP. Or contractual agreements that say, hey, we want you to credit us as a client to show that when you contribute any work that you do as part of your contract with us. So we have end user organizations who want a reputation in Drupal as having let people give back, and they say, hey, as part of our contract, please credit us. And that part of that motivation. So these are the things that are like amazing. They're awesome. And, you know, the benefit for them is they can find organizations who want to work with them because, right, you know, oftentimes an organization is, or the people within it anyway, are motivated by being allowed to give back, by being allowed to participate in more fully and with a client who really understands open source. And then the other sort of obvious one is if that end user is needing internal Drupal talent in the future, then that end user organization can now also point to, hey, look at the cool things that you can do. Look how we contribute. You can come work for us and find a good place.
So, Tim, if I'm understanding you correctly, and I think I am, you're saying that like essentially a form of gaming the system, or there have been people or organizations doing this where they're basically cooking the books. Like they have an agreement with a client that says, hey, you're going to make this many contributions. And they're like, oh, we're down by like 20. Let's go like.
That could be one of them. The more common one I've seen is, like I said, an RFP has come out and it said, hey, you need a minimum of this in order to be eligible. And so they come in and they're trying to hit that minimum before an RFP deadline.
Okay.
So that's another one that I've seen.
So I'm gonna ask a question, and we're gonna go down a rabbit hole here. I don't think this is one of our questions, but you had said, the Drupal Association kind of governs. There's a committee to govern the credit system and everything.
Yeah.
When we find or you guys find a company or an individual that is doing these sort of things, are they blackballed from the credit system? Are they
That's a really good question.
What's the ramification? Because like,
what are the consequences?
that statement of like, hey, I'm using it to get an RFP, or I'm using it to like meet a contractual obligation to a client, or I'm just using it to improve, kind of annoys me, and I want to know what's happening.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And stepping back for a second, we have to go back to, in theory, there are ways to authentically do that. Hey, if you're newly motivated to say, oh, we now have to contribute more so that we can participate in those RFPs, that's not fundamentally a bad thing. But again, if the way you're doing it is it's a week before the deadline and you're spamming a bunch of crap inauthentically, then yeah, not legit.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, in terms of consequences and how we sort of manage those things, to date, so far, we have not had to bring very serious consequences against a particular organization or individual. We have primarily been able to do it based on conversations, sort of, again, our motivation here, we don't want to be punitive if we don't have to. So if we can have a conversation with an organization or an individual and say, hey, you are missing the mark here. We want to see, more authentic contribution, or, hey, this specific thing, cut it out, that sort of a thing. For the moment, that has largely been successful, especially combined with some changes to the algorithmic part of the stuff for marketplace gaming. Like, we've made several tweaks. We're careful with it because we don't want to change it too drastically all the time. But we've made several tweaks to take away the value of some of the sort of spammy type contributions. Like, for example, just a couple weeks ago, we changed it so you don't get automatically checked for credit just for attaching all kinds of file types. It's now only for patch file types, right? So you could do it by attaching screenshots or all sorts of random things. And we were seeing a wave of sort of screenshot spam that in many cases didn't apply a merge request or patch first to make it useful for a review. It was just sort of a default installation, and it just wasn't. So we've swapped something like that around. So those are a few of the tools we use. We've talked about, and there's been some proposals before, that maybe we do need a penalty box kind of system, where we could, we could potentially say, hey, we're going to temporarily not count any of your credit for 30 days, or we're going to apply some kind of multiplier against a particular project that you were doing because you've who knows. That's been proposed. It's something I'd like to avoid because that gets us into the space as people who have to maintain it of potentially arguing with the ref, right? When it's a systematic thing, it's much easier to feel fair and balanced and enforced equally. But when it's arguing with the ref, it gets tricky.
It makes me think of like community service. Like, hey, instead of being in the penalty box, like, hey, you have to do community service. So like all of your credits, like kind of like, I don't know, they not that they don't count, but you have to do like a certain amount of credits, right? Like, hey, you've got 40 credits of community service you have to do, and like those credits don't count, but like you have to work them off in order.
It would be kind of interesting. I mean, we start building complicated stuff, but I do like what I fundamentally like about what you're saying is we frame it in a positive way, that a restorative way that gives people a path to becoming those legitimate contributors. Again, the biggest goal is to have this big tent to attract more people to contribute, and to have those contributions support our community at large, right? To be valuable to our community at large. So even when we're talking about the sort of punitive measures or the policing measures or whatever we want to call it, we still want those to help support that goal ultimately.
And one of my questions that comes up during this is you've said in general you've been able to just have a discussion with the individual organization. They've been able to correct their behavior. Is part of that also rolling back some of the, for lack of a better word, inauthentic credits?
Yeah, so that can be part of it as well, and that's a good question. And we should pause for a moment to explain credit attributions. So that's, again, you go back and you say, hey, I did it on behalf of a company or as an individual or behalf of a client, right? Those are something that the end user making the contribution controls. And there's a credit table at the bottom of those issues, and that credit table has everybody who made an attribution and a bunch of checkboxes. And sometimes those checkboxes do get automatically checked because we assume that if you made a merge request, it's probably a valuable contribution to the discussion, right? But it's the maintainer of the project who closes that issue who ultimately decides if those contributions count. They can check or uncheck any of those attribution boxes to decide whether that person gets credit. So we actually do have that layer of human intervention. Now, we don't want to burn out those maintainers by having them have to police a lot of inauthentic contributions, but at the same time, they can often already just not grant credit for any of these things that feel inauthentic, and then by the fact that, hey, you did that work, but it didn't pay off for you at all, hopefully, eliminate those behaviors. And I do want to shout out the core team. XJM and others on the core team, Quiet One, various folks have built a detailed guide to how the core committers grant credit on issues. And it's, if you're a maintainer of another project and you're trying to wrap your head around, well, how do I do this? I feel uncomfortable unchecking someone's credit, but I don't think it was value. They have all sorts of guidelines that they follow. And again, that layer of human validation of, yes, this contribution was there, is, I think really important. And it just skirts around that issue of arguing with the ref, while also, requiring that human engagement that is ultimately part of any community contribution process.
So because I sent us down this rabbit hole, and I think it was a useful rabbit hole, but I'm gonna climb us back out of it and jump back onto our agenda here with my next question. And I know
before you move on, John, I actually want to bring it back to my original question. Yeah. So no, we're gonna get out of the rabbit hole, but I want to get back to the original question because I think there's a couple other motivations that I can think of, and I'd just like to hear you guys' opinion on this. So we've talked about, one of the motivations can be the marketplace, one of the motivations can be for RFPs, but I think there's probably 2 or 3 other big motivations that people have with any type of system, but this one in particular. One is trying to get a job. So showing contributions. John said it on the show in the past, whenever he's interviewing somebody, he looks at their D.O profile and sees what contributions they've made. By the way, the credit system makes it much easier to see that than in the past. Another one that I think of is, like you said, you kind of do these batch reports every year, like who's been contributing in the top 20 or top 30, trying to get on that list, I think can be a motivation for people to game the system. And just the dopamine hit you get for getting a credit. There's a reason why gamification works.
Right. And exactly. There's a reason why gamification works. And that dopamine, and again, we have to say the gamification itself, or that dopamine hit, is not necessarily a negative. That's not necessarily exploiting the system in any particular way. It's a good thing if we can give people, it's the nature of the contribution itself that determines whether or not it's authentic or inauthentic. But yes, these are all motivations just to get credits, sort of, period, not necessarily to game it.
I have to think, though, the dopamine hit isn't as great if it's just like, hey, I found a way to artificially inflate my stats. Wow, way to go.
No, and I think, you run into that when one of the things that sort of worries me is that what part of what's happening here is you potentially have part of the source of the that's a hard word, inauthenticity. We're going to assume that's a word, is that you might have a company that sets KPIs because they want more contribution credits for the organization. They may set quarterly KPIs for their team to say, hey, you need to hit X number of credits. And suddenly you have a team member who thinks their performance review is dependent on credits. So instead of a contribution dopamine hit, it becomes a workplace anxiety, which is kind of, it's a negative reinforcer instead of a positive reinforcer. And that's not behavior we would want to see, but I suspect it's happening in a couple places.
So it's funny because you, Tim and Nick, have both brought up an interesting point here, and it's corporate pressure, right? Corporate pressure to see open source contribution. And this kind of actually leads into my next question around how the credit system is used. So, I think I have very strong feelings about corporate pressure to contribute to the open source community. I think it's important. Absolutely. I think companies should support it. But the two instances that you guys brought up where companies are tying it to some sort of benefit structure or KPIs, job performance, to me feels very, very wrong because, as you just said, Tim, right? That's kind of like a reason for somebody to need to game or want to game the credit system. So, I think, I don't think that's a great approach, but I don't think it's a great approach for, a few reasons. And one of the biggest being it doesn't really look good for the company if their employee gets pinned as somebody who's gaming the system, right? And of course the company, if they're suggesting that their employees game the system, could just say, oh, well, they were acting alone, we don't, and kind of hang them out to dry, right? And that's nefarious. I don't think that's happening. That's probably not a widespread thing, but I think it's one of those things where companies don't want that bad press, right? So I think the majority are going to support people to do that, right? So let me get to the question here, and it's about how the credit system is used, right? We've talked about how it's used by individuals and organizations in the aspect of Drupal, but to dive into that kind of KPIs aspect of it, and this is something I know that we have worked on. Tim and I have had a conversation about this in reference to EPAM and using the data of the credit system for kind of internal tracking of open source contributions, right? So I know my company is doing that, right? But I'm wondering if there are other ways people are using kind of the credit system data, either for internal tracking or, more of a scientific look into contribution, things like that.
Yes. So the answer to both is yes. And I think the example of what EPAM is doing is actually a good one. There are several organizations that I'm aware of because they've reached out to me for help figuring out how to do this, who are finding ways to kind of pull together their organization's contribution data and the contribution of individuals within their organization, and use that to kind of measure internally how their company's participating in open source, and what people are finding to contribute on. And in an ideal scenario, what that does is offer the company data they can point to say, yes, it is valuable to us to give that 20% time every Friday or whatever to have people give back, or to be able to say, oh, wow, you've been contributing to X module. We haven't used that in client sites yet. Maybe we should, or maybe we should officially kind of support that module more, or to say, hey, here's something else that's been important to our clients. Maybe you could contribute to those things internally as part of this work with this client. There's a lot of things that you can do kind of internally, and you can create some incentive programs, but they really need to be non-punitive and more rewarding. And like, part of it is, one of the things about job performance is you shouldn't, and I say this as a manager, right? Holding someone accountable to performance when they don't control all the conditions of success is just fundamentally unfair. And when they even don't control even the most basic conditions of success within a company, you know who the manager is, you know who decides, who commits the work, who reviews the work, you know, like those things are in your control. So if there was something unfair going on, you could fix it. But for a community contributor, right, if they're trying to contribute a core feature that's not part of a major initiative, and they just can't get time from someone to review it, so it lingers and lingers, and they miss a deadline, that's not their fault, right? They're participating in the process. They're maybe doing very good work, and penalizing them for that wouldn't make any sense at all. You want to continue to encourage them to engage and find places to engage. So anyway, that's one element of it. Is I really think that in the same way that the incentive structures we create externally are all based on positive reinforcement, internal incentive structures to be successful and to be fair need to be the same. Sorry, but the question was, how else are we using it? So the other thing is data. So Dries does that annual report that you referred to a moment ago, John, about contribution within the ecosystem. And in that report, it talks about the overall amount of contribution. It talks about regional contribution, so we can get a sense of which parts of the world are most active in Drupal. It talks about sort of the top contributors for the year, both organizationally and individually. And he does some analysis to say, well, here's what's missing, or here's a category of organization that for whatever reason is still not motivated to contribute, is still absent. Can we do something to motivate that category of folks? So that data, whether it's used internally by Dries and the Drupal Association, or whether other folks like Matthew Tift or other people out there in the community are doing analysis of it, can kind of tell us about open source. It's one of those things where Drupal continues to be one of the only projects where we know how much contribution is sponsored and how much is volunteer, like factually. Like the fact that roughly 67% of contributions were done on company time is something most open source projects have no idea about. And it's a great model. And that brings me to a last place where this data is used, which is it's used by some open source organizations that study these sorts of things. So there are other groups out there under Cloud Native Computing Foundation and Linux Foundation and things like that, who are looking at health of open source ecosystems and contribution to open source ecosystems, and looking at the Drupal project as a model for what else could be done.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that's really, from a company standpoint, that's one of the ways that we're looking at it as well, right? Is like we're our office we have a whole group of people dedicated to open source contribution, and they're looking at this data as just one metric as to how the overall company is performing in the open source space. And I can't echo enough your sentiment of, like, from a managerial point of view and an industry and company point of view, like, making open source contribution like punitive is completely wrong. Like it should be you should be supporting your employees. You should be supporting your developers to contribute to open source. And
you should think of contribution as professional development, not performance.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Kind of category of managerial practice that you should put it in.
Absolutely. I mean, that's 100% accurate.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about some of the ways that people can game the system. I'm curious about the scale of the problem. Is this something that you're having to deal with every day, every week, every month? Is it just come in fits and spurts? Like how much of a how much do you have to manage the system to keep it running?
You know, it's a really interesting question, because if you were viewing it purely from the data point of view, right? If you were just saying, okay, what are the outputs that the system is creating? It actually doesn't look like we have a very big problem. Because from the outputs, when you start looking at the first 5 pages of the marketplace, or when you look at the people who wind up in the top contributors list, or various sorts of those factors in terms of what data is coming out of the system, it actually, if you were gut checking it against who you know contributes and who you see around in the community, you'd be like, oh yeah, this seems about right. Like, for the most part, the data output is good. So the problem is not necessarily in the algorithmic controls. The problem is, you know, we have enough manual intervention with those maintainers being empowered, but that last point is where we see the problem, because the problem is not necessarily the system. The problem is more that there's risk of burnout and there's risk of frustration. So it's human problems, right? Because again, we don't want to take people who are already contributing a huge amount, namely project maintainers especially, and burn them out on becoming contribution police. And so the system can be working perfectly, but if in order to do so, those maintainers are having to constantly deal with bad contributions, inauthentic contributions, then the data would all look good, but it's still failing because it's burning out those key people. Now, how much is that happening? It's happening some, hopefully not overwhelmingly. I try to talk to those maintainers when I see those frustrations. So there was a good thread about this by Matt Glaman on Twitter that resulted in Mike Herschel, who is one of those community elected members of our board and therefore part of the governance model for the system, writing a blog post, which we'll link in the show notes, about that sort of issue, about this. What we've seen recently, that most recent example was the one I talked earlier about screenshots supposedly showing a patch applied, but often with a patch that didn't apply, so the screenshot wasn't valid, all those sorts of things being spammed across a bunch of projects. So that resulted in some frustration where maintainers were like, well, now I have a bunch of extra chores to do to kind of get rid of this low effort stuff. And at the same time, people who don't realize that the maintainers can prevent that from getting credit might see those and think, oh, they're going to get a bunch of credit for it. It's working for them, without knowing that actually the maintainers are preventing it from working. It's just taking that intervention. So in that case, that problem, that's one of those issues where, okay, the outputs are working, but bubbling up in the background is, the amount of chores that it takes to maintain the system for our maintainers got too high. Let's make a change to the Drupal.org's credit code base to say, hey, no more automatic checkbox for those screenshots. And then so hopefully that drops that burnout level. And if there's another one, we try and make another tweak of that kind.
It also helps make it more consistent, because if a maintainer isn't doing that chore, then the output will start to suffer as well.
Right, exactly.
Some maintainers may not need to know that. I will share with you this. The only frustration I have with the credit system, as somebody who gives credit every week for the show, is how difficult sometimes it is to find somebody that didn't comment on an issue to give them credit.
I should say there has been a recent improvement. It's no longer case sensitive, that autocomplete.
Oh, that'll help.
Yeah. that one got me all the time for doing initiative meeting credits, because I run like 3 different initiative meetings every week. And it was case sensitive for a long time because years and years ago, Drupal.org usernames were case sensitive. So there could be Dries with a capital D and Dries with a lowercase d. And those could be 2 different user accounts. And that was disabled a long time back, but the underlying database cleanup hadn't been done. And we finally got that done and finally fixed the autocomplete widgets. So at least you don't have to get the case right when you're searching for other users. But I agree with you. It can be tricky.
That's very, I mean, even if sometimes I can find the person on like their user profile, but I still can't get them to show up in that widget. It's pretty rare.
Interesting.
But I've had situations like that where there's just too many people's names similar to theirs that even if I have the exact match, they don't show up in the list of 10.
Interesting.
But
in my head, I just had a funny thought of like having this conversation back when like you could have Dries with a capital D and Dries with a lowercase d, because I feel like gaming the system with duplicates would be like, X multiplier there. But
there was all sorts of stuff, and also being able to just post an issue and have your username look like it was Dries or whatever, right? Like, and when we added UTF-8 MB4 or whatever, the extended character set support, when you could have a letter that looks like a capital D but isn't a capital D, and all that. There was all sorts of stuff that got messy. But that's kind of the malicious stuff where it's like, no, we're going to block you. Like, that's not questionable.
If you see a user account DRLES pop up,
that I have no hesitation about blocking that kind of stuff. I'm actually curious though, when we're talking about how big of a problem is this, what's your perception of it from your point of view?
So, I mean, from my point of view personally, I don't see it as that big of a problem. I have heard kind of like grumblings here and grumblings there about like people, doing things that were like kind of questionable. And, obviously, again, like read the show title, repeat it to yourself. Don't game the credit system. But I think, for me, it doesn't seem like rampant, I guess. Nick, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, the only real high level insight I see and I have into this is those annual reports that Dries and Matthew kind of put together. And like you said, I assume that's one of your gut checks. And if you had that report and all of a sudden these random people showed up at the top of the list and nobody we knew was the top 20, something would happen behind this. You would modify the system before you put that report out because you want to give credit where it's due. But that's my major like high level overview, and I don't see anything there that really raises flags. I would say the biggest interaction that I have with the credit system is when and I've mentioned this on past shows. Like I see two scenarios. Like I've done something on an issue. I think I would expect credit, and I don't get credit. And you don't want to be the person that like comments on, be like, hey, why didn't you give me credit? So just try to whatever I contributed. Or like in the case of a core issue, I thought I had done something that deserved credit. I read that you had mentioned this earlier. There's a list of like, here's how you get core credit. I've looked at those and like, oh, I didn't do one of the tasks that would get core credit. It makes sense that I didn't get it. Now I know if I want to get credit on a core issue, I have to do X, Y, Z, which is fine. The other thing I see, again, related to that is and this is usually in smaller modules. And again, it's not, I'm saying it because it's things I've seen, but personally, it's not a big deal. Like as long as the stuff gets in, but I seen it, I report an issue, I create a patch, create a merge request, put that in. The maintainer sees that issue, is fixing something else, pulls in my changes on a different issue and releases them, and then closes the issue. And sometimes you don't get credit for that. But again, the bug is fixed. So that's the most important thing.
What's interesting here is I think both of those examples reflect the control that's put in maintainer hands over how to do and it's necessary control, right? We need to give them that control over their projects to understand how they're just choosing to do those attributions. And to me, what's interesting about that part of contribution recognition is that's what makes us play with those defaults, right? That's why for a while all file attachments automatically checked the box, because we thought, okay, that probably means legitimate things. And then when we started to see certain kinds of file attachments aren't as helpful, we changed that. And again, there's only so much we can do, and there'll be that human side from there. But I think that's a really interesting example, right?
So and I think part of it too is like some maintainers don't, they might maintain a Drupal module, but they don't interact with the Drupal community, so they don't know really what the credit system is. They just, when they fix something, they just close the issue, right? Which I think is fine too. That's legitimate. Like if that's how you're going to contribute, that's fine. I mean, I'd much rather a bug get fixed and not get credit for it then the bug never get fixed.
I mean, in the end, we're building great software, and all of this support structure around it is just about encouraging that. So as long as that's still happening.
But it could have the reverse effect, right? So to Nick's example, and that was actually something I was going to bring up as a prelude to my next question, is like, there have been instances where like I've basically tested a patch, right, or confirmed there's an issue on something based on like the reproduction rules and said like, yep, that patch works, or yep, that's an issue, and never gotten credit, even though like I took the steps to get the patch and do that. Which, to Nick's point, like, hey, if something gets fixed and I don't get credit for it, like that's fine. But I think there are also other instances, and I actually just ran into this with a coworker. They were new to Drupal.org. Their user account hadn't been confirmed yet, and they put in an issue on Drupal.org, and it actually got marked as spam. And like, which I didn't even know that happened, and I was like, this is kind of awesome, but like I can see as a new person coming in, kind of unfortunate.
We really need that emphasis in people's minds, and it's hard, right? Because once you've been trying to fix things up, and once you see that inauthenticity, you get frustrated. You start feeling less generous on first impressions, right? But we do need to reemphasize with all the folks doing manual intervention that, right, the best thing you can do when you see something that seems wrong is to try and turn it into an on-ramp to good behavior.
Well, I wonder if there's a way to highlight, and I'm sure this is difficult to implement, Tim. So sorry for this feature request, but the thing is, this type of issue where like I did something, I didn't get credit for it, for seasoned contributors, that's much less of an issue, I think. Like I said, I'm okay
for a brand new person.
For a brand new person, that could be something that turns them off to contributing.
So
maybe there's a way to highlight, this person has never contributed to your project. Consider giving them credit for this thing.
We do have a feature request just for a general like little badge or something that's like new contributor or new Drupal.org user. That's like, hey, so if their account's only 6 months old or something, or
let me close the circle on that interaction, right? And and then maybe Nick, I can ask my question. We'll see. Just saying. The individual commented in our team's channel, and some of the more seasoned contributors were able to help her out, get her account verified. That was like the first thing, and then once that the account was verified, she was able to like resave the issue or comment on the issue and have it actually be untagged as spam. So it all worked out in the end, which was awesome. But the question that I have, and we've already kind of talked about this, it should be kind of evident to this point, right? When you're dealing with a person's motivation or like human analysis to try to figure out if somebody's gaming something, like how it's a hard problem to solve, right? Like, how do you combat that? And is there something we're missing here? I mean, it seems like that is really the root problem that we're all trying to solve.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And my opinion has always been not just related to the credit system, the contribution recognition system. And by the way, sorry, let me step back to that correction I just made to myself. We talk about the credit system a lot. I frequently deliberately try to say the contribution recognition system rather than call it the credit system, because I think that emphasizes what it's really for, right? It's not for like storing up credits that we're spending for stuff, or like it's not your arcade tickets. It's about recognizing contribution. And I think that just slightly changes the conversation. But the reason it's such a hard problem is exactly what you said. The hardest problems in technology and open source are people problems, not technology problems. We have smart people who can solve the technological aspects of these issues, but you can't really design an algorithm or a feature to solve a problem of human motivation, to solve a problem of human intent, right? the best you can do is guess algorithmically, and then ultimately you rely on a person to validate that. And that's why maintainers are essential to the system. They provide that level of human insight that's necessary, it's just fundamentally necessary to really making that work. So yeah, it's a difficult problem to solve, and it's part of why I'll also say about our community, all technology communities, open source communities, everyone's always very eager to start proposing technical solutions to things that may still remain people problems. So, when we talk about, hey, do we penalty box companies, or could we write a script that says you can only get 20 credits at a given month on a single project, or could we all like different things that people have proposed? The answer to that is yes, you could do a lot of those things. But in the end, have you just made a more complicated system that still needs a human to validate, to say yes or no, that actually worked?
And those will, and this is kind of the other side of these types of recognition programs, is if you add those types of things, you start de-incentivizing certain behavior, or incentivizing the wrong behavior. Like if you put an upper limit of credits, people are like, well, I'm at the limit, I'm not going to do anything for the next 16 days.
It does more harm than good, right?
Yeah.
Or the other way, if they're in a penalty box, they're like, oh, I'll just create a new user account, right? And start from there.
We'll create another fake employee on our something like that.
Exactly. So it's a difficult problem to solve. It's and like you said, it's a people problem, not a technology problem.
Not exclusively a technology problem. Technology can help. We talked about that with file attachments, absolutely.
But so Mike Herschel had written a blog post that we mentioned. It's going to be linked in the show notes for sure, talking about valuing contributions. And I think the term value related to contributions is a dangerous line, but it is probably something worth talking about. How do you approach the question of, like, I guess maybe the best way for this question is, how do you decide how to weight contributions, and how do you approach the question of whether a contribution is high or low value?
This is a good question, and let me say that the use of the language low and high value is not ultimately the language I think we should use, in part because I actually think it's on a different axis from authentic and inauthentic contribution that we've been talking about. When we're talking about gaming the system, it's more about authentic versus inauthentic action. And a low value contribution is still a contribution, right? I would love, and those are really important for the beginning of someone's contribution journey. So you could call those small little documentation fixes, quote, low value, but they get someone on the path to building higher things. So I do think that these are possibly on the wrong axis. But there's another concern I have with this language, and it's part of why when Mike and I were talking about putting up his blog post, I expressed some of these concerns, but ultimately we decided to leave it in because I think we needed to have this public conversation about why those terms are uncomfortable. So, John, you had actually pinged me about this when you saw the blog post go up.
I did.
And why don't you? I would actually love for you to express the kind of anxiety that created for you, because I think that's a really interesting example, and I think it reflects what a lot of people feel.
Yeah, it was just the term, low versus high value, right? So, like, as somebody who, if you don't know by now, thinks that non-code contribution is just as important as code contribution, and that first-time contributors are just as important as long-time contributors.
Yep,
right?
100%.
The term high value and low value, the fact that we are valuing a contribution, seemed just fundamentally wrong, and to me, in my Drupal brain, seemed like un-Drupal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I understand that contributions, and Tim, I think actually your axes of in reference to gamification of like authentic versus non-authentic and like value, I think that was a great way to describe like gamification and gaming the system, right? Obviously we want authentic contributions. The value, high value, low value, to me feels wrong, as you just said, but I think like the way to frame it is more of like level of effort, right? Because in my mind, like all contributions have value. If they are authentic contributions, they have value. And as somebody who is not, I know enough PHP to be dangerous, very dangerous. I feel that, sometimes going in and just editing a word in help text or rewriting some help text so it's more user friendly is super valuable. It's a valuable contribution in my opinion, but it's not overly difficult. It's editing one string, right? But to say that's a low or high value contribution, it seems wrong to me.
I think part of the problem is I think the level of effort is starting to get to it, but I think even that's not exactly what we're getting at. I think part of the issue is, like you said, Tim, there's two axes. There's the authenticity axis, and then the axis that we're talking about right now. And I think part of the reason why it's difficult is it's actually measuring multiple things. So one is, how much time does this contribution take, right? So for example, editing one line in one project is one thing, but I remember Amy June has talked about one of the first contributions she made was fixing a help style across the whole core project, which again, individually, each one is a quick thing, but making sure that the stylistic language of the help text across all core projects is correct is a great example. A large time investment. There's also the level of expertise needed to do whatever the task is, whether it's validate something or fix something. Like there's some things that we had Jake on last week, and he manages some really complex projects, so he's probably a good example. There's some things that for him would be a low level of effort to fix because he's used to that API or familiar with that. But for me, it would be very difficult for me to do because I'm just not familiar with that code base. So some of it is time, some of it's expertise, also the complexity. There's some modules that one person, or the modules, I don't know why I said that. There's some issues where one person can do the whole task and fix it. There's some issues where, like with the easy out of the box initiative, So, for example, there's issues with like the project browser where they're trying to get graphic designers to create logos for the top 100 modules of given categories, right? Not just one person can do that individual task, so it's a little bit more complex. There's also the level of effort. So this axis, so to speak, I think is complex because you're reducing 4 or 5 things into one low versus high.
But Nick, you've just single-handedly illustrated my point, right? My point here isn't
we're on the same side of this point. Yeah.
Right. My point here isn't that there isn't a level of effort, and there is low level of effort and high level of effort. I'm the first one to admit that. It's the sentiment, right? To say, hey, your contribution is low value is derogatory, quite frankly. Like if somebody said that to me, I'd be very hurt. I'd be very insulted. Like, and I would be very vocal because I have a podcast and a Twitter account and whatnot. But like if I'm a new or first time contributor, like to say, oh, that's a low value contribution, it becomes hurtful, right? So I think framing it as level of effort, right? Oh, this has a low level of effort, high level of effort. Level of effort can also have different metrics that go into calculating it, right?
Yeah.
It could be time, it could be experience, it could be difficulty. Like all of those things factor in. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's difficult to do even on an individual issue as well, because like, for example, if there's a core issue that's really gnarly that, somebody fixed, and then I come in and make some comments in code style, check the patch, make sure it works, and maybe fix a typo. My contribution is helping move that on. But my individual contribution was a low level of effort contribution, even if it's one of the nastiest core bugs to exist, right?
Yeah.
So even individual issues, contributions on that issue can have this scale. So it's, I don't envy needing to figure out how to reflect that, because
there's a lot that could be done, right? Like, it's very complex as a system. And again, part of what you have to say is, it's almost a sort of a resolution or granularity of output problem, or that's at least the perspective I use to triage what we could do versus what we should do, which is to say, okay, if we zoomed in and added a bunch more paperwork for the individual contributor or for the maintainer to rank, let's say, a couple more axes. We gave them, please put a rank on level of effort or a time investment or impact, or maybe we just did one of those. Maybe that would actually be not too much paperwork. But let's say we added a bunch of paperwork for those things. How much would that actually change the final output of, the list of credit on their profile, of the marketplace ranking, of the yearly reports? Is it worth the investment in that extra paperwork? And part of it is psychologically, it often feels like it should be. It feels like, gosh, that would be more fair. But at the same time, if it doesn't really result in a significant change to the output we're getting, we should try and keep the system simpler. And that's part of that trade-off. But briefly going back to what I think is really important, the impact of the language we choose to use when we talk about gaming the system. I totally agree that low versus high value sends the wrong message about what we are criticizing when we criticize gaming of the system. We're not criticizing the value, we're criticizing that authenticity or lack of authenticity, I think, is really more important in the way we talk about that. So anyway.
So I mentioned this a little bit, but have you seen any instances where that terminology or even gaming the credit system has impacted first-time contributors or first-time contribution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have seen, again, that very human, hey, did the terminology cause someone to just bounce off of the project and not come back? Unfortunately, I don't know that without the help of some other employee of the same organization saying, hey, this really bummed out our new contributor. Unfortunately, I don't know that I would know. I don't know how I would find out. And that's tricky. That's why I want to be so careful and default to that positive language always, because once they bounce, we might lose track of that. But on the other hand, what we definitely have seen is we've definitely seen first-time contributors participating in what people have called gaming. Which is to say, because if we have an organization that says, hey, we made it a KPI that you need 90 contributions a quarter, right? We see someone whose account is new, they're an employee of a Drupal shop, they've probably done some good work, but now they're trying to pump numbers, and some of that, and it's not that they're not capable of doing something better, but once you have been seen to cross-post 20 issues, it's hard to come back from when someone explains, hey, here's a better way to contribute. And they're like, but I still have to hit my KPI, and they can't say that out loud so easily. So that I think I have seen, and I'm still struggling with how do we get all these people who now, hey, great, we've legitimately got some hundreds of new people who are like doing their first patches, but can we make them the right kind?
I mean, I just want to interject here that scenario makes my blood boil. Like, I have to hit KPIs, and if your company's doing that, like, EPAM is always hiring. You can come work for us. We won't force you to commit to open source projects if you don't want to. We'll encourage you to commit because it's the right thing to do.
I mean, one way to see it too is to see if organizations' employees are averaging the same number of contributions per X time period. Like if every month their 10 employees each have 30 plus or minus a couple contributions, or each quarter they have 90 or 30, whatever, then it's like, okay, what incentive do they have where every single employee is doing the exact same number of contributions?
And one thing I should say, one thing I've offered to do with several companies, and I don't know if I could do it with every organization in the ecosystem, but I have more capacity to do more right now, is I'm happy to go run a webinar, an internal webinar for a company and talk about contribution, and talk about your company's contribution culture and how you can, how you should set up your contribution culture internally, what you can do, the best ways to get involved. Like, I've done that with several organizations who've reached out and said, hey, we just kind of want some help figuring out how we do this right when we first start. So
Tim,
if anyone out there is listening,
not that you need any help talking about that, but I'd be more than happy to team up with you if you needed.
You know what? That would be amazing, because I also
extra set of hands.
Exactly. Just to scale this up, I think at some point it would be wonderful to assemble the people who have built those good contribution cultures in their organizations and share that out. Maybe do a roundtable at a DrupalCon, maybe do a webinar, maybe offer to do these one-on-one things. I think that'd be really cool.
Interesting. So if I'm a Drupal.org user and I see something or a maintainer of a project, or I'm just looking at a couple of profiles for some purpose and I see some activity that seems suspicious.
It's like the airport, Nick. See something, say something.
Is there anything that I can do? Who should I talk to if I have questions?
Yeah, so there's a few answers depending. I'll say the easiest and simplest answer is you could drop me a message. You could send a message to Tim at association.drupal.org or to Hestenet on the Drupal Slack about what your concern is, and I could help guide you to, depending on what it is, to where that goes. You can also talk to the community elected members of the board. And that's reasonable. The other thing I would say, though, is there's sort of a few scenarios. If you're seeing something that looks like bad behavior and you're not directly involved, reaching out to us is, I think, the best thing. If you are, let's take another example, a more positive example, like Nick. If it's one of those where it's like you did a contribution, you're pretty sure you felt like it needed credit, and you don't necessarily want to say something to annoy people, but you just kind of like to check. One thing you can do is you can ask a maintainer, hey, what more could I have done on this issue to get credit? And if you put it very politely, right? If you say it again in that way, how could I help you more in order to have gotten credit in these ways? Then oftentimes, A, you're not being demanding. And B, oftentimes they'll look at it and they'll say, oh, actually, no, that was great. I just missed it. Here you go. That kind of thing. So I think that's reasonable. And then lastly,
before you get to your last point, I'd like to add one thing in there, I think, is like, also, if you're looking at like non-code credit, right? Definitely reach out. Like, feel free to reach out to me or Nick, because that is definitely something that we struggled with, especially with Talking Drupal when we were thinking about giving people credit. I know there are a lot of events and camps out there where like you have the ability to get non-code contribution credit. And sometimes that feels a little weird and feels a little like you may be gaming the system. If you need to run it by somebody, happy to jump in and support that.
And I would say I'm also someone who's more of a technical manager than a developer. And my contributions prior to implementing the credit system in 2016. So see, this is where I reveal that it was all for myself. No, but prior to that, you could see a few commits and you could see a few documentation edits on my profile. And that was kind of all that was there. And once we started crediting non-code contributions, I now feel like my profile shows who I am within the community. I think that's really important. And those non-code contributions are just as, if not in some cases, more important than individual code contributions. So
I mean that's true for me too. With once we started recording Talking Drupal credit, that's when it showed that I had contributions. Most of my other ones were just smaller code changes in various modules. But
I actually cut Tim off. He was going to make a third point, and I want to make sure we get to it.
Yeah, that's right. So what if someone's not using the credit system correctly? So we talked about, if you're seeing it as an uninvolved party, you can reach out to myself or to the community elected members of the board. If you're concerned about credit that you feel you should have received, you can politely ask what more you should have done of a maintainer. If you are a maintainer and you're seeing this behavior there's a few things. One, of course, you cannot credit it if it's really inauthentic and and they won't engage with you, or you just don't have that time to engage. But secondly, you can use some tools, some guidelines, either from the core recommendations, which we can probably link in the show notes. I'll find those. Or you can, try and reach out to that user. Encourage you to, if you have the bandwidth for that emotional labor, to reach out to them and say, hey, these contributions, they're just missing the mark. They're not really supporting me as much as I need. Here's something else you could do, or here's how you could improve this contribution so that it would be more useful to my project. And if you're willing and able to do that, that would really help.
I do want to clarify one thing though, or ask a clarifying question. So if I see an individual, group of individuals from an organization doing what I consider abuse, I imagine you don't want community members trying to address that level themselves. I imagine that's something
I just don't want. Here's the issue. I don't think anybody benefits from a sort of from a call out culture around this. Not that you can't create social pressure and create change in a good way. That is possible. But a call out culture, especially when it's coming from, a user who's not particularly involved in that project. It's right. If you're not the maintainer of that project, it's not the organization you work for. It just could get tricky, especially if that organization is a competitor and you're technically competing for marketplace space. You don't want to get into this weird fight. Like,
it's also noise, right?
Yeah. And it's more fair to you if a neutral party can be brought in to help mediate that, both to you and to them, to just eliminate any bad feeling that might come around. So, and it can be noise. It can fill up the conversation with stuff that, like, one of the examples of this is like I mentioned fairly early on. We do sometimes have folks come in and say, hey, this person's been gaming, they're spamming all these things. And we look at it and it's like, well, they are trying to do that, and all the maintainers are not giving them credit for it. So it's not working. So like the level of what we need to do, it's not as severe as you might think it is necessarily, which is part of the reason why talking to someone who can check on that is.
I guess my point was, like, if you're going back and forth with somebody on a issue on Drupal.org and like, hey, you're gaming, no, you're not. Yes, I am. Like, that's the kind of like email noise that I was more referring to. But your point is true as well. Like, that kind of broad spectrum noise.
Yeah. And there's also, I've been talking about the DA committees for governing this. There are times when it could also become a matter of sort of a community working group issue, but that's different. That's if it goes beyond, hey, that's if it went beyond, you're not responding to us trying to address the issue with you. You're not engaging meaningfully with the governance group, then it might become sort of separately a sort of CWG kind of thing. But for the most part, it's not really. It's more about, hey, can we manage behavior incentives? Can we have a restorative conversation with people?
Tim, it has been great chatting with you about this. Before we sign off, any final thoughts on this topic that you'd like to share?
Yeah. I think the most fundamental thing is when we get caught up in the details of what feels like, what can feel frustrating, what can feel bad, what looks like someone getting more for less effort when I did something really hard and got the same, all those sorts of things, it's just really important to remember it's not a zero-sum game. There's not a pool of only this many credits that anyone can have. Like, we're here to build a contribution recognition system because we want to understand how our community contributes, encourage that contribution, and grow that contribution. And so, use that lens whenever you're looking at issues surrounding the contribution system. Use that lens of, how do I respond to this in a way that helps further that goal of growing our community? And I think that's the way that we find the right answers to these frustrations and to solving gaming and to all these problems.
Well, Tim, thank you for joining us for these last 4 weeks. It's been a pleasure. Looking forward to, I think we have another episode coming up that I hinted at in the pre-show, but definitely looking forward to that as well. Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event just like Stephen did here today on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's book corner, and much more. Sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that big button in the sidebar that says Become a Patron. So, Tim, as Nick said, thank you for joining us for the last 4 episodes. If somebody wanted to reach out to you, question, comment, how would they go about doing that?
You can find me at drupal.org/u/Hestenet on drupal.org. I'm Hestenet on Drupal Slack as well. And my email is tim@association.drupal.org.
And Nick Laughlin, where can our listeners find you?
At Nixman, pretty much everywhere, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.